For today's video, I wanted to talk about some of the top remaining UFAs in the NHL and give you guys my thoughts on when I think they might sign and ultimately who they might sign with. September 1st is just around the corner, and I'm actually quite puzzled as to why some of these guys are still on the open market. So for today's video, I'm going to go over 6 of the top defensemen left and 6 of the top forwards left and let you guys know where I think they will go and just what's going to happen with that player. So without wasting any more time, let's jump right into the video. So as you guys can see on the screen here, we have 6 forwards and 6 defensemen, all of which are still unrestricted free agents, and I kind of wanted to touch on all these players specifically. Still some big names out there. You obviously see Jake Gardiner on the screen. I'm still kind of baffled as to why he's not on an NHL roster, but maybe he's waiting to see what happens with the Mitch Marner situation. Maybe he wants to return to the Leafs. That definitely could be a possibility, but I'm pretty intrigued to see what happens with him. But I'm going to start with the forwards, and I guess I'll just start at the top with Justin Williams. 44 points last year for the Carolina Hurricanes, was definitely an important player for their team, and his decision comes down to either retirement or returning to the Carolina Hurricanes probably for one final year. And if I had to guess, I think he is going to return. I think he can probably still be a 40+ point guy. He's definitely an important player because of his leadership in that young Carolina locker room. He's their captain, was a big piece of their team this past season. I hope he returns for at least one more season, and I'm pretty sure the Carolina organization definitely wants him back as well. Moving on now, I'm just going to group these two guys together because honestly, I think Patty Marleau and Joe Thornton are both going to sign with the San Jose Sharks eventually. Probably both on 1 year, very cheap contracts, maybe a 2-year deal for Patrick Marleau or something like that. But in my opinion, I can't really see them signing anywhere but with the San Jose organization. And I think it would be big for them to bring them back because they did lose a bit of their depth this summer. They lost Joe Pavelski, they lost Jonas Donskoy, and they lost Gustav Nyquist. And I think Patrick Marleau and Joe Thornton are definitely still players that you want in the locker room. And obviously, it would be very nice to see Patty Marleau and Joe Thornton get one last shot at winning a Stanley Cup together in the San Jose Sharks organization. And it's not like these guys are washed up and can't do anything at all at the NHL level. Joe Thornton just had 51 points this past season, and I think he will do just fine again in like a third line center role. And same goes for Patty Marleau. I think he will do good. He had 16 goals last year, 37 total points, had a good previous 2 seasons in the Maple Leafs organization, and I think if you play him in a similar role in San Jose, maybe even on the third line with a guy like Joe Thornton, that would definitely do more good for this San Jose team than it would do bad. And I think if you bring them both in on like 1 year, very cheap contracts, it definitely helps them and towards their quest for a Stanley Cup. Moving on now to a player who I definitely watched a lot of this past season because he was a member of the Red Wings, and that is Thomas Vanek. And honestly, with Vanek, I wouldn't even be surprised if he calls it a career. He's been bouncing around the league so much, over the past, 5 to 10 years of his career, that I honestly wouldn't think it would be the worst decision if he does retire. But if he doesn't, I still think there is a team out there that could use him. Maybe not on like a guaranteed contract, but I certainly think some teams will at least give him a professional tryout and invite him to training camp and see what he can do. Because last year for Detroit, he had 16 goals and 20 assists for 36 points. A decent year for Thomas Vanek. Was injured a little bit, but when he was on the ice, he was putting up decent offensive numbers. He's a veteran guy who definitely knows his way around the offensive zone, and like I said, I think there is probably a team out there that could use maybe a secondary playmaker on the second power play unit, and in my opinion, Thomas Vanek can definitely do that for at least 1 more year. I don't really know any teams off the top of my head that could use a guy like Vanek, but like I said, don't be surprised if we see in the news in the coming days that he gets invited to a training camp. Moving along now to the next forward, and that is 34-year-old centerman Brian Boyle. And while yes, maybe his best years on the ice are behind him, wherever he goes, he ends up as a fan favorite. Everybody loves the guy, and I'm sure players in the locker room definitely appreciate being around him. Last year, before being traded to the Nashville Predators, he had 13 goals and 6 assists for the Devils in 47 games, so he still puts up good goal totals, and I definitely think he's another guy who could at least get invited to a training camp on a professional tryout. He can probably still score over 10 goals at an NHL level, maybe play a 4th line center role, kill some penalties, and like I said, be a really good player in the locker room, and definitely a guy that the fans can get attached to. Even though he's bounced around the league, like I said, he's definitely one of the more likable guys that we have in the NHL. I'm not quite sure if we're going to see him sign a contract, in the coming weeks. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if maybe he does decide to retire. He did have some, injury scares over the course of his career so far, but Brian Boyle, like I said, an amazing guy, and hopefully he can get a job out there somewhere if that's what he's looking for. Moving on now to the final forward I wanted to talk about, and that is Riley Sheahan. And I wanted to talk about him because he was a member of the Detroit Red Wings for a long time, and he was the guy that always made me so mad because you'd watch him play, and the skill, the size, and the speed is there for him to be like a 15-goal scorer, but in the 2016-17 season for Detroit, he played 80 games and he didn't score a goal until the final game of the season, where he eventually scored 2. So he finished that year with 2 goals. Then he was a member of the Pittsburgh Penguins through the 2017-18 season, and then was traded at the 2018-19 deadline to the Florida Panthers, and now he finds himself as an unrestricted free agent. And honestly, he's a guy who I think will definitely get a job somewhere. He's still only 27 years old, had 10 points in 33 games for Florida after the trade. Like I said, he's a guy who I definitely think can give you over 10 goals and be a solid bottom 6 forward. So he's a player I would look out that in the coming weeks should maybe get like a 1-year prove-it contract somewhere at least. Moving on over to the defensemen now, starting from the bottom, Adam McQuaid. He's a guy who honestly I wouldn't be surprised if he stays a free agent for a long time, but honestly I think he would work on any team in the NHL as like an extra defenseman who could come in and play a physical role on that bottom pairing if he needs to, or if somebody goes down with injury. I think he can slot in and still play top 6 minutes. Probably not for a full season, but definitely a guy who could get his games in at an NHL level still, but I'm just not quite sure. I'm not really trying to think of any teams off the top of my head that could use a guy like McQuaid, because like I said, I honestly think he would just work for any organization in terms of just like an extra defenseman. And honestly, same goes for Mark Method, who's the player I have next on the list in terms of defensemen. Obviously his best years are behind him. He had some decent years in Ottawa, then was a member of the Dallas Stars, and now finds himself as a UFA, and in my opinion in a similar situation to Adam McQuaid, where I think he would probably work on any team as like a extra defenseman who could come in if someone does get injured. Out of the two, I honestly don't know who I'd rather have. Probably Adam McQuaid because he's a little bit younger, but again, I wouldn't be surprised if we see these guys stay on the open market for a long time. Moving along now to the next defenseman, and that is Dion Phaneuf. Played last year for the LA Kings, and it was a pretty bad year for him, but also take into consideration it was a pretty bad year for everybody on the LA Kings. Dion Phaneuf is now 34 years old. Obviously his best years are behind him, and I'm honestly kind of leaning towards putting him in the same category as Mark Method and Adam McQuaid in terms of him probably just being like a bottom pairing or maybe even an extra defenseman if he eventually does get a job somewhere. But Dion Phaneuf seems like the player to me that wouldn't want to be an extra defenseman. He'd probably want to be playing or just not playing at all, and I'm honestly not quite sure if any team in the NHL could use a guy like Phaneuf. Maybe there's a team out there that needs a bottom pairing defenseman on a very cheap contract, and if you take that in consideration, he probably can get a job somewhere. But again, he's a player who I think could stay a free agent for a long time, or maybe even just calls it quits or gets a professional tryout somewhere. Moving along now to Nicholas Cromwell, defenseman for the Detroit Red Wings. Obviously a player that I've watched a lot of over the course of his career, and he's definitely getting, on the back nine of his career, not the defenseman he used to be whatsoever. And honestly, for Nick Cromwell, I think it's either the Detroit Red Wings or he retires. And honestly, if I had to guess, I'm kind of leaning towards retirement, because I think if he wasn't, he probably would have said by now, if he was coming back to the NHL to play one more year with the Red Wings. Steve Yzerman did come out and say that if Cromwell does want to come back, there is a spot for him on the Red Wings. And me as a Red Wings fan, I love Nick Cromwell. I love everything he's done for the organization over his career, but I honestly think he probably should just lean towards retirement. You don't want to risk like a really bad injury, especially if it's just, it's your final year. And I think we should just kind of let the youth take over the blue line. Guys like Dennis Cholowski, Phil Peronic, even guys like Madison Bowie. I think we should just let those guys get all the ice time and, not focus on a guy like Nick Cromwell. He definitely could still be a decent guy in the locker room for the young guys to be around, but if I had to guess, I think it was probably his last NHL season that we just watched this past year. And now finally, finishing out the video with the biggest name free agent left there on the market, and that is Jake Gardiner, a defenseman who's capable of 50 points, and I just don't really know what is going on with him. Is it that he's asking for too much money, or is he waiting to see what happens with Mitch Marner and the Toronto Maple Leafs, because maybe he wants to return to the Maple Leafs on at least maybe like a 1-year prove-it contract? He did have some back issues this past season, and that definitely could be concerning for some teams out there, but even still, I'm just baffled that he isn't under a contract with a roster out there somewhere. A team like the Philadelphia Flyers have a lot of cap space. I think that's an option there. Maybe they go after Jake Gardiner. A team like the New Jersey Devils definitely have the money to sign him. And then obviously there has been a lot of rumors tied between him and the Toronto Maple Leafs that Kyle Dubas wants to sign both Mitch Marner and Jake Gardiner, which that just seems impossible at this point in my opinion, especially considering how much of a hassle the Mitch Marner situation has been. And I honestly think it would just be best if the Leafs and Jake Gardiner both move on and part ways, and Jake Gardiner goes and signs somewhere else, because Gardiner is a player that has been heavily criticized over his tenure with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and I think it would be best for him if he just got a fresh start somewhere. But honestly, at this point, I have no clue what's going to happen with Jake Gardiner. Like I said, a team like Philadelphia has the money, same with the New Jersey Devils, someone like that could use a guy like Jake Gardiner, and I'm just kind of confused as to why he's still a free agent. But make sure you guys let me know down in the comment section, why do you think Jake Gardiner is still unsigned, and ultimately, what do you think in the end is going to happen with all of these UFAs remaining? So that is going to do it for this video. I really hope you guys did enjoy. Sorry if it was a little bit boring, but I did eventually want to make this video, especially since a guy, as big of a name and player Jake Gardiner is still on the open market. And make sure you guys let me know down in the comment section your predictions on what you think is going to happen with all the players that I touched on in this video, and maybe some other players that I didn't talk about. You can let me know all your thoughts down in the comment section below. And thank you guys so much for watching today's video. If you did enjoy, make sure to drop a like on it and subscribe to the channel for daily NHL content. And I will see you guys all in the next video.